Okay, so what we'll do in this session is we'll go ahead and start in the middle of the quiz here for chapter 7. So I think I went to the question where we ended. I might be mistaken, but I'll jump in, go into screen share. Okay, so I'm pretty sure this was the question where we stopped on last Friday. So a load diverter, which is typically part of a charge controller, reduces the system load demand when the array is not generating enough power. That's not correct. Redirects excess power to the grid for net metering through a grid-tied inverter. That again is not the case. The power is directed to the grid just because it's the path of least resistance. There is no device that directs the power to the grid. It's like water flowing downhill. It's just a physical nature. When you're connected to the grid with your system and it's generating power, it's generating at a higher, like think of it as a higher pressure than the grid. So the point of low pressure would be if you turn on a load, the power is going to rush in and fill that load. But if there is no load to service and you still have more pressure from your array, the grid becomes the low pressure zone and the power will flow out to the grid. And then of course the meter reads that and runs backwards. But if you're not generating enough power and you turn on multiple loads, well, then the load is the low pressure. There's not enough to service it from the array, so the power flows in from the grid and the meter runs forward. So power will always flow to the path of least resistance and from higher voltage to lower voltage. And we've had some debates in classes different times. Is our system operating at a slightly higher voltage than the grid? And I've never actually been able to find that. It sounds like it might. It would have to be a fraction of a volt, but maybe not. So I don't want to say that's the case, but anyway, it goes to the path of least resistance. It reduces the load from the array so the battery bank doesn't overcharge. No, well, that's basically what a charge controller does, is make sure the battery doesn't overcharge. So a load diverter or a load dump redirects excess power from the array to a load dump, such as a hot water heater. So what we're talking about here in a standalone system is essentially, if I draw a picture here of what I'm talking about, if I've got a solar system, a PV array, so I've got my PV array here, I would go into a junction box or a combiner box. Then I'm going to go to my DC disconnect. Then I'm going to go to my charge controller. From the charge controller, I go to my battery bank. From the battery bank, I go to an inverter. And then from the inverter, I'm going to go to my load center. And it's usually going to be the main because there's no other power source. So the charge controller controls the array's charge to the battery bank. And these things need to be compatible. But often it may also go out, say, to a load dump. And typically that's going to be a hot water heater. So what it's going to do is it's going to say, okay, I'm generating power. The sun is out over here. Looks like a fried egg. And I don't have enough load to service. I'm generating more power than my loads require. Well, of course, it's going to want to charge the batteries, but if the batteries are fully charged, your loads are not taking what you have available from the array. Nothing bad would happen if that were the situation. It's just that you would have excess power available to you that you're not utilizing. So it would be an economic opportunity loss. So what they usually will do is run an electric water heater element into the water heater from the charge controller. So when I have extra power, I'm just going to heat water. And that would be referred to as a load dump. You're just taking advantage of the power when you have it. The water heater would probably be a natural gas or a wood burning hot water heater, because for a standalone system, having an electric hot water heater would be quite a load. But So it's not depending on the solar electric for heat, but you're utilizing it and offsetting some of your natural gas consumption. So it's an economic issue rather than a a, a functional issue that there would be a problem if you didn't have a load belt. Okay, which of the following is not a factor in determining the size in amp hours of a standalone battery bank? Well, the system daily load requirements, that's what we look for first, right? Almost always when we're doing our math, the first thing we need to know is what are the load requirements? And we do it on a daily basis because the sun comes out on a daily basis. We also need to know the nominal voltage of the system because in order to figure out amp hours, well, watt hours equals amp hours times volts. So I would divide my watt hour requirements by voltage. Peak hours of sunlight, insolation, no, we don't need to know that. But we do need to know depth of discharge. So if I wanted to talk about a typical battery bank sizing requirement, normally what I would do is I would say, all right, I've got, let's just say 2.5 kilowatt hours per day is my load. That's my typical load. Well, then I need to know what is the voltage of my system. So I would take 2.5 kilowatts, and let's say it's a 48 volt system. I would divide 2,500 divided by 48, and I end up at 52.08. And that would be amp hours per day. Okay, so now I've taken my voltage, I've divided my load, and I find out how many amp hours I need each day to service the load that I have, 52.8. But then I need to know some other things. Well, how many days do I want this thing to run if there is no sunlight? It might be one day. I mean, there will be sunlight, but maybe not a lot. So do I want 1 day of autonomy, 2 days of autonomy, 3, half a day, 4 hours? You know, it doesn't have to be a full day. But let's assume we want 2 days of autonomy. That's just something that you're going to have to decide. Well, then we'd be looking at 104 amp hours for our system. But we can't stop there because with lead acid batteries, we can't use the whole amount of power that's in the battery. We can't drain it down to zero. So we've already set our depth of discharge, and that's usually set within the inverter. So for a standalone system, normally you're going to be dealing with about a 50% depth of discharge, but you could set it anywhere between, say, 10% and 90%. You can never really go to zero. But let's assume a 50% depth of discharge. So now we're going to need a 208 amp hour battery bank in order to service this load. But there's one more thing we need to do is we need to derate for the inverter. And the reason we do that is if you remember the system, there's a solar array, there's a charge controller, there's a battery, then there's an inverter, and then there's the load. Well, the only piece of electronics that's between the battery and the load is the inverter. So the way we would derate from the battery to the load, we have to derate for the efficiency of the inverter. So if we've got a 90% efficient inverter, I would derate here, and it would be 208 divided by 0.9. And so I need a 231 amp hour system. It's got to be 48 volts, 231. So that's how I would size it with a lead acid battery system. That would be a typical battery sizing system. With lithium ion, it's usually done a little bit differently. They're normally sold by kilowatt hours. And so if I had a 2.5 kilowatt hour system per day, it's really straightforward because they build in all of the inefficiencies, all of the depth of discharge. So if I went out to buy a system, I would buy a 2.5 kW system, a kilowatt hour system, lithium ion battery, if I only needed 1 day of autonomy. If I needed 2 days of autonomy, I'd buy a 5 kilowatt hour battery bank, lithium ion. And it seems to me the Tesla Powerwall is like a 13 kilowatt hour system. So that's how that works. Back to the questions. All right, so the one thing I don't need to know here is peak hours. That wasn't part of our equation. Everything else there I needed to know in order to size a lead acid battery bank system. Okay, a standalone PV system has the following characteristics: a 3 kW array, a daily load of 10 kilowatt hours, a maximum power draw of 2 kilowatts at any one time, 1400 amp hour battery bank, a nominal battery bank voltage of 48 volts, and 4 hours of peak sunlight. What is the minimum power rating for this system's inverter? Well, the thing you need to know is with a standalone system, the inverter is based on the maximum power draw, not on anything else. This is the only thing that's going to be basing the size of your inverter. And so I have a 2 kW power draw, so the minimum is going to be a 2 kW. Now, in a standalone system, we'd like to have at least a 25% overhead. So I could say that really a 3 kW would be a better choice out of these, but it asks what is the minimum power rating. So we're looking at 2 kW as the minimum power rating. And this is an important concept to understand, is if I look here at my drawing of a standalone system, the important concept is with a standalone system, when I turn on an appliance or a load, basically what's happening is power is being drawn from the battery through the inverter to the load. Okay, so you can think of it as pulling power out of the battery through the inverter. I don't even have to have a solar array attached to this. It's the battery that's driving the load. The function of the battery or the solar array is to recharge the battery. But there's kind of a hard stop between those. This is one part of the system. This is another part of the system, and they can independently act without the other part of the system. So 100% of what goes through the inverter is based on the load. And the maximum power draw is the maximum load that can occur at any one time. So that's what's going to determine the size of your inverter. So that is what the case is in a standalone system. But in a grid-tied system, let's say I've got my array here, and I'm going to go to my DC disconnect, an inverter, an AC disconnect. Then I'm going to go into my service panel here. I've got a main disconnect. It's going to come up to the utility, to the meter, and then out to the telephone pole. That's my transformer. Okay, so this is the system for a grid-tied system. Well, what happens? What happens when I turn on a load? Well, the first thing it's going to do is it's going to draw it through here, and it's going to go service the load. So that's my first choice. But what happens if I turn on more load than what I need or what I'm generating? Well, then it's also going to pull from here, and it's going to service these loads. And these will be happening simultaneously. So that not all of the power is being drawn through the inverter for the loads, only that that's coming from the array. So then what happens if I am generating more power than I need? Well, some of it is going to go to the load, but some of it is going to go back out onto the grid. So the grid becomes a load. So at all times, the amount of power flowing through an inverter is based on the size of the array, because whatever the array is generating is going to flow through the inverter. It is divorced. It has nothing to do with the load. So the concepts are completely different for a grid-tied system versus a standalone. With a standalone, 100% of what goes through the inverter is dictated by the load. With a grid-tied system, 100% of what goes through is dictated by the array. But it's important not to think that if I've got a 5 kW array, I've got to have a 5 kW inverter, because while they are related, they do not have to be the same thing. And that's where we get into the whole concept of clipping. I don't want to confuse this question with that, but they are related, but they're not exactly the same thing. Hopefully I haven't confused you with that. Okay, which of the following is not an advantage of microinverters over string inverters? Well, there's no need to do string calculations. That's sure an advantage. They're easily accessible for repairs. Well, let's set that aside for a minute. They're more efficient than string inverters. Typically they are. They reduce aging panel mismatch, or they reduce aging and panel mismatch. Yes, they do, because each panel is operating independently. What we mean by aging panel mismatch is some panels age better than others, just like some human beings age better than others. Well, if you hook up in a string, the string operates at whatever the worst panel in the string is doing. So if one is aging less well and being less efficient, well, then that affects the whole string. But with microinverters, each operate independently. So the correct answer here would be they're not easily accessible for repairs, because typically your inverter is going to be up on your roof underneath your panels. Whereas with a string inverter, they're going to be in the garage or in the basement. Usually a lot easier to get to. Which of the following equipment will likely not comply with the 2014 NEC requirement for rapid shutdown? Power optimizers, microinverters, a UL listed 1741 string inverter, or a remote disconnecting combiner box. Well, what the 2014 NEC with rapid shutdown said is when I pull the lever for the AC disconnect, it's got to shut down at the array. And so power optimizers will shut down at the array, microinverters will shut down at the array, and also a remote disconnecting combiner box will. But a UL 1741 string inverter is just a regular old string inverter. So that would not comply with the rapid shutdown provision. The average home in 2010 consumed 960 kilowatt hours of electricity per month. Assuming 4.2 hours of insolation at the site and a 90% derate factor, basically meaning your system is 10% inefficient, what size will the array be to power this home? Well, we're saying it's 960, 4.2. So if I go in here and do the math, so we said it was 960 kilowatt hours per month. We also said, what, 4.2 hours of insolation, I think, and a 0.9 D rate. So that's the info we need. So the first thing we need to know is what is the daily load? Well, this is the monthly load. So I usually like to divide by 30.5, 30 and a half days per month. You can do 30, you can do 31. It's not going to be much different. So if I do 960 divided by 30 30.5. I'm getting 31.47. So that would be 31.47 kilowatt hours per day. I get 4.2 hours of insolation each day. So it's going to be 4.2 hours per day. Notice that the hours per day cancel. So my answer is going to be in kilowatts or in watts. So I'm going to divide 31.47 by 4.2, and I end up at 7.49. Oops, 0.49 kilowatts. So that's the size system I would need if it were 100% efficient, but it's not. It's only 90% efficient. So I divide that by the D rate, and I end up with an 8.3 2 kW system. So that's how you figure out. That's a straightforward and array sizing exercise as there is. You start with your daily load. If you're given your monthly load, you divide it by 30.5. If you're given your yearly load, you divide it by 365. You get your daily load, divide that by the hours of insolation, and then derate that for efficiency. And that's going to give you the size of your array. So we come back here and we find that the 8.33 is going to be the correct answer, or it better be. Otherwise, I did something wrong. And that just shows you how you would size your array. Okay, a homeowner in Phoenix, Arizona has a daily load requirement of 9.6 kW, kilowatt hours per day. She's opted to use microinverters that produce 250 watts. She set it at an altitude of 25 degrees, giving her 6.54 hours of insolation. I'm going to write these numbers down so I don't forget. All right, so it's 9.6, 250 watts, 6.54 hours. Assuming she's picked a panel that's at least 250 watts and her system is 95% efficient, so that's our D rate. How many panels does she need? Well, let's walk through that problem. All right, so we said her total system is 9.6 kilowatt hours, and I think that was per day. So we divide that by 6.54 hours per day. Those cancel out, and we get, I'm hitting my calculator here, 9,600 divided by 6.5, 1477. So 1,477 watts, or 1.477 watts. That's what the size would be if it were 100% efficient, but it's not. It's only 95% efficient. So we divide that by the D rate, divided by 0.95, and we end up at 1,554. If you get a smaller number, then you multiplied times your D rate. You didn't divide. So 1,554. So that's the size of the array, 1,554 watts. But the question was how many panels? And we said that we're using 250 watt panels. So I divide this by 250 and I end up with 6.2. So I get 6.2 panels. And I got that by dividing 250 watts per panel. And the question was, how many panels do I need to fully service the load? So I would have to round up. So the answer is going to be 7 panels because you can't use part of a panel. So my answer here is going to be 7 panels. And hopefully that will be right. Yep. All right, a cabin sits on a mountain in North Carolina. The location has a latitude of 35 degrees with 8.4 hours of insolation. Now, what I'll point out here is we're beginning to get information we don't need. So you're going to have to know what information you need and what information you don't need, because the world provides you with more information that you need. The daily load is 3 kilowatt hours per day. The designer is using a 48-volt battery bank. It's been derated at 75%. The inverter is 95% efficient. The temperature extremes, coldest temperature 37, hottest 43. The batteries that we're using for 2 days of autonomy are 6 volt, 250 amp hour with a 60% depth of discharge. So the question is, how many batteries do we need? So I'll jump into my whiteboard. All right, and so how do we do a battery bank program? Well, our battery bank problem, first thing we need to know is the daily load. And we were told it's going to be 3 kW, so I'm going to say 3,000 watt hours per day. Okay, so we take our daily load requirement and we then divide it because we're looking to get amp hours. So how do we go from watt hours per day to amp hours per day? We divide it by our system voltage. So we would take 3,000 divided by 48 volts, and now we're at 62.5 amp hours per day. Well, we were told we wanted 2 days of autonomy. So I've got 2 days. So that's going to be, what's that, 125? Yep. So I need a system that's 125 amp hours. Whoops, amp hours. Now, it told me that my entire system was derated at 75%, but my inverter was 95%. Well, I only need to derate for my inverter because the system derate includes all the stuff that happens before the batteries plus the batteries' inefficiency themselves. So I'm only worried about what it is from the battery to the load, and that's going to be the inverter. So I'm going to divide that by 0.95, which is the inverter derate. And now I end up with 131.5 amp hours. And then I also need to derate this by the depth of discharge because I can't use all of the power in the battery. And we were told we're going to a 60% depth of discharge, which means we're only going to use 40% of the batteries. So that's at a 0.6 DOD. So I divide that by 0.6, and now we're at a 219.29 amp hour. So we need a 48-volt system that's 219 amp hours. But we were also told that we're going to use a 250 amp hour battery. So how many 250 amp hour batteries do I need to get 219 amp hours? Well, it turns out one will do it. I only need one string. It'll actually provide more than enough. I'll have some extra capacity. So I need one string. So that doesn't mean I need one battery. It means I need one string. And I was told that these batteries are 6 volt. So, and it's a 48-volt system. So I need to divide 48 volts by 6 volts. And if I do that, I think it's going to be 8. 48 divided by 6. So I need 8 batteries per string. Per string. This is the system. And this is the battery. So 8 batteries per string, I only need one string. So the answer is I need 8 batteries. That gives me an option here. And that's going to be my correct answer. So that's how you do a battery sizing string problem. Hopefully you'll have some options to just do a few of these, because it's really something that becomes quite easy once you've done them. You know, if you've done 50 of them, you know, then you're going to feel confident. I don't know how many of you will do 50, but which of the following would not be a factor to be considered when derating a PV system? All right, it's not a factor. The inverter inefficiency, well, we've seen that it is. Total solar resource, soiling, or voltage drop. Well, of these, total solar resource is basically how much power is available at the site. So soiling, if you get dust on your panel, that reduces the efficiency of the panel. Voltage drop, we say we want to limit that to no more than 2% of the overall system, the inverter inefficiency. So the answer here, because it's not, would be total solar resource. A system that has been designed with an 8.5 kW solar array and a 7.6 kW inverter, this system is said to have a 1.19, and what we're talking about is an inverter to load ratio. And that's fairly typical. The reason why we're doing this is really talking about the whole concept of clipping. And if I stop the share here, I can show this graphically, why clipping works. Well, first off, remember that the production curve of a system, let's talk about a single panel. If I see that assume that's a perfect bell curve, this would be solar noon. That's when the system is producing most of its power. And it's going to be pretty much a typical bell curve from beginning to end. If we're talking about standard test conditions, if this were 250 watts, and we had a 250 watt inverter, then this is the way it would work. We would capture 100% of the power that is produced. Okay? And this is what people would normally think of. You would want a 250 watt panel, a 250 watt inverter. But the reality is, most days we do not have ideal weather. So you might only have standard test conditions of maybe a dozen days out of the year. So most of the time you're going to have curves that are down below this. So what happens if I put a 300 watt panel with a 250 watt inverter? Well, the curve then ends up looking more like this. And this would be the 300 watt. Okay, so what's going on here on a standard test condition day? Now, bear in mind, most days, this panel, even though it's 300 watts, will never produce above 250 watts. So you'll capture all of the power that's being produced regardless with either panel on most days. But on a standard test condition days, this bit of power here will be clipped. It will be cut off, because you're only able to generate 250 even though the power the panel is generating 300. But what you'll see is the shoulders here, all this extra power here that's being generated with the bigger panel will be greater. This will be greater than what's lost. So you'll still come out ahead having a bigger panel. The only downside of clipping is that you're going to be paying for the capacity of the panel, you know, that you might not use on some occasions. But the cost difference between panels and inverters have gotten to the place where economically a 1.2 ratio is good. That's typically what people are going to be designing to. So if you have, let's say, a 12 kW array, you'll probably only need a 10 kW inverter. That would be a 1.2 ratio, load to inverter or inverter load ratio. It's been determined that a home requires a 6.5 kW array. The homeowner has purchased 26 SolarWorld 250 panels from her brother-in-law. At her location, the temperature extremes are -37 and 41 or 43. Her string inverter is operating in an input range of 100 to 550. So the maximum voltage is 550 volts. The solar panels have the following characteristics. What is the maximum number of panels in each string? These are the kind of problems that really get people. They get people freaking out. So how do we determine this? And I'm going to have to try and remember. Oops, I don't want to do that. I need to write these things down first. All right, so I'm telling myself here, it's 6.5 kW array, and it's a VOC 37.8 volts, temperature coefficient 0.3 at VOC, and coldest temperature -37. Hottest is 43. All right, so conceptually what we're dealing with here is we know that this panel will generate 37.8 volts maximum, the VOC, that's considered the maximum voltage the panel could produce under standard test conditions. So assuming that we were at 25 degrees Celsius, we could just simply take the maximum voltage from the inverter, which is 550. I could divide that, 550 divided by 37.8 volts, and I would find out I could put 14.55 panels in a string to get to 550 volts. Well, I don't want to exceed 550 volts, so I would round that number down, and my maximum in a string would be 14. That would assume that we're operating at standard test conditions all the time. But we know that the colder it gets, the more voltage the panel will produce. Well, how much more voltage will it produce? Well, it's telling me that it will produce 0.3% per degree Celsius. So let's walk through the math. How do I figure out on the coldest day ever what the voltage of that panel will be? So the first thing I'm going to do is find the delta between, it was 37, yeah, -37 to 25, that's standard test conditions. So I want to know what is the delta between those. And so I'm going to get 37 basically plus 25. So that's going to be what, 62 degrees? That's the delta. There's a difference between these two numbers of 62 degrees Fahrenheit. And I know for every degree Celsius, that is different, that's colder, I will multiply that times 0.3, because this is 0.3% per degree Celsius. Well, the degrees Celsius will cancel, and I will get 62 times 0.3 is 18.6%. So basically it's saying on the coldest day ever, this panel will generate 18.6% more voltage than it would under standard test conditions. So I'm going to take the VOC, which was 37.8 volts, times 118.6%, because I've got 100% of it, plus I'm adding 18.6% more. And I can convert this to a decimal by simply going 1.186, dividing that by 100. So I take 37.8 times 1.186, And I find out on the coldest day ever, this panel might produce 44.83 volts DC. So each panel might produce 44.83 volts. So I take my inverter's maximum limit, which is 550 volts DC. I divide that by 44.83 volts DC, which is what it might produce on the coldest day ever recorded at that location. And I'll end up with 44.83 equals 12.26 panels max. Well, I don't want to exceed it, so I've got to round down. So it's going to be 12. So the answer here is going to be 12 panels maximum. Let's see if I've done it right. I'll select 12. And lo and behold, we are correct. And in here, it's got all of the equations there. Now it's asking me, okay, well, what about on the hottest day ever? What is the minimum panels? So the VOC, or the VMP, sorry, is 31.1 volts, and the temperature coefficient is 0.45%. So it really is just the same, but it's also telling me it's a ground-mounted system. So that's important information to know. Whoops, I didn't want to do that. I want to stop the share here and go to the whiteboard. So it's the same process. We're basically going to find the delta, the difference between 43 degrees, which is the hottest temperature ever, and 25 degrees, which is standard test conditions. And that's going to be, what, 18 degrees Celsius? That's the difference. But we all know that it's hotter on a roof than it is on ambient air temperature. It's hotter on the ground. So what we have to do is, for ground-mounted systems, we add 25 degrees Celsius. For flush-to-roof mounted systems, we add 30 degrees, or sorry, for offset, we add 35 for flush-to-roof. And for ballasted systems, anything that's off the roof but on a roof, you know, a few inches or a foot or two off, that's going to be 30 degrees Celsius. So it's 25 for ground mounted, 30 degrees for a ballasted system, and 35 degrees for flush to roof. Well, we were told this was a ground mounted system. So now I need to add 25 degrees Celsius, and now it's going to be 18 plus 25. So 43 degrees. So it's possible on that ground mounted system that the temperature of the panel will be 43 degrees more than standard test conditions, which is 25 degrees. And that's what all our measurements are at. So with this, we want to err on the side of what it's operating at, not VOC. So we'll use VMP. And the VMP was, before I do that, I'll do the temperature coefficient. So I'm going to take 43 degrees times 0.545% per degree Celsius, because that's the temperature coefficient when you start at VMP, and it's going to be times 0.45, and it's going to be 19.35. So what that's saying is, on the hottest day ever, this panel will likely produce 19.35% less voltage than it would under standard test conditions. The hotter it gets, the less the voltage. So what is the voltage? Well, the voltage is VMP. So I'm going to multiply 31.1 volts times, now here it's 100% minus 19.31%, or basically 80.65%. And I can convert that to a decimal, 0.8065, and I'll multiply 31.1 times 0.8065, and we end up at 25 25.08 volts DC. So on the hottest day ever, this panel might only produce 25 volts, as opposed to on the coldest day, it was up there, I don't remember exactly, but it was like 44 volts. So what do I need to know? Well, I need to know what is the minimum amount of power that the inverter needs to turn on. And going by memory, it seems to me it was 150 volts. I might have to check that. But that was the minimum for the inverter. We're at 25.08 volts. And so I divide 150 by 25.08, and I end up at 5.98. So I need 5.98 panels minimum. So I'll round up to 6. So that's the minimum number of panels I will need on the hottest day ever at that site in order for the inverter even to turn on. So the answer is going to be 6. Come on. Oh, it already jumped there, but incorrect. It's going to be 6. Trust me, it's 6. I already jumped ahead by clicking the wrong button. Okay, everybody hopefully clear on that. These are some of the things that confuse people. So you may want to replay this over and over and over just to see what I'm doing there. Hopefully not going too quick, but I do know that you've got the recording so you can replay it. When the DC power feeding an inverter is more than the inverter's rated capacity, the resulting loss is referred to, and I mentioned earlier, that's just called clipping. And that's a very common practice in today's industry. We typically size the inverter smaller than the array because the cost of the inverter is more percentage-wise than the array, and we get a better economic outcome by clipping. And it used to be we would clip about 1.1. Now it's 1.2. It's moving towards 1.3. And all that is a reflection of the disparity in cost between solar panels and inverters. The electronics are just comparatively more expensive than the panels. Fluctuation in a DC waveform caused by connecting the DC system to the AC system is referred to as, and this is a difficult concept to get, but it's called ripple. And pretty much what we're talking about there is, if you remember that every electrical circuit is a circuit. So when we're going from DC to AC, the power will return again to the battery in a complete circuit, but it goes back through the inverter and has to be converted back from AC to DC. Well, in the process of going from DC, which is a flat sine wave, it's not even a sine wave, it's just a flat wave, to a sine wave, and you get that, well, when it comes back, it has a little bit of an echo of the sine wave. It's not 100% flat. So what that means in practice is the DC current going into the battery is slightly fluctuating because of the little bit of ripple that's left. It's like the echo of a wave, tiny little ripple. And remember that if we're talking about a fixed voltage or a fixed wattage, then that ripple, that variation, is going to change variation in voltage and variation in amperage for the same amount. And so there's always going to be a little bit of ripple in the system, but you want to minimize it, and because it does wear out your battery system. It will cause excessive wear and tear on your system. So there are ways you can electronically smooth that out, but just be aware that that's what that term means. The voltage in which a grid-tied inverter operates most efficiently is referred to as its MPPT voltage range. They like to use the term MPPT, it's maximum power point tracking. It's basically when you see the reading on an inverter, it might say that its minimum is 150, its maximum is 550 or 600, but the MPPT is 250 to 450. That's the range where it operates at its most efficient. So that's where you want to be. According to the NEC, when wire is enclosed in a PVC pipe that's buried in a trench, it must be located a minimum of, and oh my gosh, I don't even remember this exactly. I think it's 18 inches. Pretty sure it's 18 inches. In the city of Columbus, I know they require it 24. So your local might be more than the NEC, but it will never be less, but it might be more. So, and I know there are some other issues here like 24 if it's direct buried. Let me just tell you, don't direct bury cable. Don't do it. Put it in conduit. You're just asking for problems if you direct bury the cable. Pipe is cheap. Make sure you put it in conduit. Which of the following is not a common or legitimate reason for opting to make a supply side connection rather than a load side connection? Well, the array is too small for a load side connection. Well, that's certainly not an option because typically it's because the array is too big. The amperage will be greater than what your load side connection can handle. There's no room in the service panel. Well, that's a very common situation. You go to install a solar array and the service panel's maxed out. There's just not any space. So that's a real common issue. The utility might require that it be a supply side connection. That can happen, especially in commercial systems. And the service panel is equipped with a main ground fault protection breaker, a GFPE breaker, and it doesn't allow for backfeeding. Remember that our solar panels are backfeeding the circuits. It goes forward, it comes back. And if you've got a ground fault protection device on your main breaker, it just may not be compatible with putting in a system. So in this case, the answer is going to be the array is too small. That's not a legitimate issue. In a case like these, you might put in a sub panel, or you might just simply have to do a supply side connection. When determining the ampacity rating for a connection between the main service panel or the service entrance cable and the AC disconnect, when it's located within 10 feet, the designer must use, well, the ampacity of the service entrance circuit. That's not true. The maximum ampacity times 1.25 of the inverter. Well, that's also not true. It's going to be the 10-foot tap rule. All right. And if you're an electrician or you've done electrical work, that hopefully is not a new concept to you. But what they're saying here, the 10-foot tap rule is outlined there on page 253 of your textbook. If you're not familiar with it, review it. But at a minimum, it's got to be 60 amps. The wire has to be rated for 60 amps and the AC disconnect has to be rated for 60 amps. That's the minimum. Your 10-foot tap rule might actually get in less than 60 amps. If that's the case, you still have to do 60 amps. 60 amps is the minimum. Using a rough rule of thumb, how much space would be required on a typical roof for an 8 kW array? Well, remember, the rough rule of thumb here is going to be about 10 watts per square foot. That's a usual. So in this case, we're saying an 8K array would need about 800 square feet in order to fit. So if you're looking at a roof, 800 square feet is like 20 by 40. You know, that's about 80 square meters. So that's just a rough rule of thumb. We get in the book about ways of sizing it much more exactly, but this is just kind of one of those. People will ask you this all the time. How much can I put on my roof? And you can just sort of measure the side of the roof facing the sun and come up with a rough estimate. Of course, it's always dangerous to give them a rough estimate because then they're going to hold you to that. Storing excess power generated in a PV array and then using the stored power during periods of high cost power is known as basically load shifting. Pretty sure that's what it is. Could be peak shaving, but it's load shifting, I'm pretty sure. Yep. And that's where you've got time of day pricing. So for instance, if you've got a solar array and it's generating a lot of power in the middle of the day, but the utility charges you, let's say 10 cents a kilowatt hour during the middle of the day and 40 cents a kilowatt hour in the evening after the sun goes down, which happens in some places like Hawaii, you might want to then store your power in the day in a battery, use the battery for those couple of hours in the evening, and you're basically shifting the cost. You know, you're using cheaper power when power is more expensive to buy. So it's known as load shifting. Okay, now I'm going to get a bad score because I just ran through the first half of these, so I answered them all wrong before we got to today's portion. But anyway, so that's going to be your residential. So hopefully you guys will be able to get through all of chapter 7, do that review, and then next week, Tuesday and Friday, what I'll try and do during those 2 days is simply go through scenarios, problems that we can just walk start to finish. We'll do array sizing, voltage drop issues, wire sizing, figure out which kind of materials we're going to use, battery bank sizing, all of the equations, string sizing for string arrays or for string inverters. So do that. Remember, we're not going to have a session on Friday of this week. And if you want to bring your electric bill, for instance, to use as an example, we can use that and we can design a system. We can design your PV system for your home. Might as well, you get a couple $1,000s worth of design value for nothing. So anyway, we'll see you guys all on Friday, all right? Take care.